became a career firefighter with the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Service, the chief of the medical division, or EMS, the unofficial historian of the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Service. Reminiscing, Part 1, 1968 to 1978. I joined the Elk City Volunteer Fire Department back on March 1st, 1968, and I was a member there until April 20th, 1970, when I became part of the career department, Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Services. Actually, April 20th of 1970, both Marty Lepore and I started that same day. And he and I continued to develop our career through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s until we retired. Different dates, but we retired. The other day, I was reminiscing, as I sometimes do, just thinking back to some of the calls that I'd been on in the past, and decided if I could take a look at any of the old newspaper clippings, etc., that might still be around that show some of the calls that I've been on over the years. And I was able to find a fair amount that reflected my career incidents that I've been on from March 1st, 1968 through 1978. The first is brush fire that we had actually after 10 days of me being in the fire department. Brush fire that occurred off of Columbia Pike that burned about a half mile down through the valley of Columbia Pike behind houses, etc. But that was my first fire. The funny thing, well, not necessarily funny, but back in those days, at least at Elk City, I wasn't assigned gear, so I just pulled a set of gear off of the coat rack, helmet, and boots, and that's how I fought the brush fire that day. My problem is that these pair of boots that I took were about 10 sizes too large. So that meant for every time I wanted to take a step, I'd have to move twice in the boot to take one step forward. The bottom line is that by the end of the day that evening, I ended up with two horrendous blisters on the heels of my feet, the size of silver dollars. And that was quite the attraction back then. And I am sure that the veteran volunteer firefighters, when they saw that of this young kid having those blisters, that it was going to be the last time that they'd ever see me at the fire station. Little did they know that I just wanted to be in the fire department. So the next day I hobbled in to the fire station ready to go once again. So that sort of amazed the folks that, I could take a licking and keep on ticking, I guess. Another incident on March 24th of 1968, we had one of the infamous brush fires and woods fires along the Patapsco Valley. Typically back then, trains would have some frequent hot boxes where the wheels of a freight train would get overheated and start throwing out sparks, and those sparks would light off brush along the railroad tracks for miles and miles and miles. And on March 24th, just one of those days where fire was lit off, and spent about 6 hours or more trudging along the Patapsco Valley, up the hills of mountains of the Patapsco Valley, fighting the brush fire. I thought it was fun and had a good time doing that. Again, just a narrative of the woods blaze spread for 20 miles. Basically, I think it went from almost Elk Ridge up to Marriottsville, something like that. So there's plenty of fire and plenty of fun for everybody. At least I thought it was fun. This was July 28th, 1968. It was a hot summer day. I can remember sitting at the house. My grandmother was there, mother and grandmother. We were sitting in the kitchen when over the pager call came in for a barn fire at Doe Reagan Manor, the historical Doe Reagan Manor. I remember I was eating vegetable soup, and I remember getting up and starting to run out the door, and my grandmother screaming at me, "You get back here, young man, and eat that soup first." Well, I didn't. And on down to the firehouse I went. I was able to catch the second engine out, and off we went. There were multiple buildings that were on fire. Unit I was assigned on, we got assigned to a bank barn and did our best to try to put that out. There are no hydrants where we were. We'd have to go back, oh my goodness gracious, about 2 miles, 3 miles to the closest hydrant, get filled up and come on back. There were several barns and buildings, sheds were on fire, so it made for a kind of neat day. So I was on the second engine out of Elk Ellicott City, which ended up being the third engine to arrive on the scene. Ellicott City's first engine, West End ship, and then the unit I was on. So we made quite the day of it out at Doregan Manor. And again, just article from July 28, 1968, talking about the fire at Doregan Manor. May 26, 1972, this was interesting, at the building called the Country Store, which is on Main Street, directly across the street from Columbia Pike. The Country Store was a granite block building, caught on fire. Actually, the third floor and roof caught on fire. What is significant that particular day was, at least back in the day, I can't speak for other departments, other agencies, but driver training was more who you knew and whatever. I had been in the department just a little over 2 years. Every now and then someone would say, hey, let's get in the fire truck, let's see if you can drive this thing. At Ellicott City, the main engines, main apparatus were diesel engines, 10-speed Road Ranger engines, and these were manual shift. So every now and then someone would take me out and we would drive around a little bit, and I'd be mashing gears and what have you. They always try to play a trick on me to stop me on a steep hill and then to get me going. But anyway, I went out a couple times, just driver training, just driving around. We'd pull into the fire station and I would pump water, both from the tank, 500-gallon tank on the apparatus, and even hook up to the hydrant and pump water. And I did that maybe once or twice. I don't think I ever drafted. But anyway, that was my driver training. That was over several months. I'd never responded on a call, on a real call, where I was going to be supervised as I drove, and I'd be supervised as I arrived on the scene and did all the things that a pump operator is supposed to do. But anyway, I digress. On this particular day, May 26, 1972, which I believe was a Friday, Mike Dorsey and I were working. It was the power shift at the Ellicott City Volunteer Fire Department. Bill Klein, who was the station sergeant, was finishing his day. He was working day work at the station, and as he got off, like at 3 o'clock, he turns around and says, hey, I'm leaving. I'm going to be going up to Pennsylvania to visit some folks. Just want to let you know that all the other volunteer drivers are not going to be around to drive. So today, Dorsey, you're driving the truck, the American France truck. Hal, you're not going to be driving the engine 22, the 10-speed Road Ranger engine. Holy mackerel, this is 3 o'clock. Lord have mercy. Again, I'd never driven on an emergency call, and I was sort of taken back. So I go out, I start looking at the pump panel, and I'm doing this and that. I think I was even sort of getting ready to take it out or spin up Main Street and back, and then back it into the station. 30 minutes after Bill left, around 3:30, we get a box alarm, fire alarm for a fire on Main Street. Lower Main Street. Oh gosh, I'm thinking, what are we going to do? Well, the good news was I figured worst case scenario, I'll get the engine into first gear, I'll nose it out of the fire station, and I'll start down Main Street, which was downhill. So, at least I'll be able to get it out of the station, and I'll be rocketing down Main Street, even though in first gear, a siren and air horns blaring, going not even as fast as you could walk. But anyway, when we're going down the hill, I'm thinking, well, yeah, Don, don't worry about it. It's going to be a smells and bells, a false alarm, a small electrical fire, so not to worry. Man, we get down to where the post office is, where you can look down Main Street, and smoke is rolling across Main Street towards Columbia Pike. I'm thinking, my goodness gracious, or words to that effect. Pull up, do lay out to the hydrant, and hook up, etc., and get a hose line going, and the crew. Dave Tumlin and Phil Gershow were the only two volunteers that came into the station. So we left with a power crew of 2 people on the truck and 2 people on the engine. I can't remember who was with me on the engine, but that was it. And as history will attest, within 30 minutes of me being cut loose as a driver of the fire engine, I caught my first fire call, I caught my first fire, and I caught my first 2-alarm fire, all within 30 minutes of me being cut loose. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Driver training back in that day, left something probably to be desired, and that's how it was done at Ellicott City. Now I'm skipping back. What we're looking at right now is one of the barns at Doregan Manor that burned, probably one of the main barns that burned back in July 28, 1968. And again, just a newspaper article about the Doregan fire. More newspaper articles about the Doregan Manor fire. Reagan Manor was also the home of John Carrollton of the Revolutionary War. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, John Carroll of Carrollton. And then again, yet another newspaper clipping of the historic manor, Reagan Manor fire back in July of 1968. As I said, I was the third engine in, and we spent quite a few hours, many hours there, and was one of the last one or two engines to leave the scene. This call was interesting, and again, remember that I had just gotten into the fire department on March 1st, 1968. I gravitated by default towards EMS. That's a story in itself, but I gravitated towards EMS early on. Also understand that I was proud that I was the highest trained EMS individual that there could be in the state of Maryland at that time. I had basic and advanced first aid and CPR. You couldn't be any better than that. Anyway, on August 29th, in that afternoon, a thunderstorm came through, but it was a dry thunderstorm, meaning a few lightning strikes, but really no rain. And sure enough, in the afternoon, we received a call for a child struck by lightning, Melba Drive, near the intersection, Route 29 and Route 99. We responded and arrived on the scene, and goodness gracious, here's a young child, obviously about 9 years of age, laying in the street, and he had been struck by lightning. All his clothes were burnt off of him. His tennis shoes that he was wearing, I don't know, I can't remember whether the tennis shoes were actually burnt off or the complete soles of his feet were burnt off. He's laying there, semi-conscious, not looking real good. First and second degree burn on his body. I said not conscious, was just moaning, and quite the sight. The other thing, because in the fire service, emergency services, you always see interesting thing that you just can't believe. And on this call, the thing that I couldn't believe, the child had been struck by lightning, and when lightning hit, burned his clothes off, but when the electricity left his body through his feet, both feet melted into the asphalt like half to 1 inch, leaving the perfect outline of both tennis shoes sunken into the asphalt, and asphalt had spewed out 360 degrees from around the patient. And I'm thinking, my goodness gracious, that was interesting. We ended up taking the child to St. Agnes Hospital, I believe. This is before helicopters, burn units, and what have you. By the grace of God, the young man eventually, after an extensive stay in St. Agnes Hospital, was able to leave and survived and lived a normal life. Having seen him struck by lightning, number one, all the clothes burnt off of him, and him being melted into the asphalt in front of his house was quite an eye-opener. The same day as the lightning strike, August 29th, 1968, later on that evening, still down at the firehouse, standing up front with Woody Collette. He and I are standing out in front of the fire station. We're minding our own business, and you can hear two cars hauling ass up Main Street, and you see them come around the corner by the post office. I mean, they are booking. I thought they're going to continue straight up Main Street. Somehow or other, both cars skidded and screeched into Fells Lane, which at that time was the street right next to the fire station, right next to the parking lot. And down Fells Lane they went. Before Woody and I could walk around the corner to look down Fells Lane to see what was happening, we can hear the cars skid to a stop, and you hear boom, boom. Holy mackerel. We get there, and what had happened is one of the two cars, occupant got out with a shotgun, and one or two rounds went off and struck at least three. I think struck more than three people, but struck at least three people. Fortunately, when the gun went off, it was pointed to the ground, so the shotgun pellets hit the ground first and then ricocheted and hit at least three people. And I'm pretty sure there were a couple more people that were hit. Woody and I, we turned around and we walked across the street to the annex, which is where the ambulance is stored, and walked over and pulled the ambulance out and down to the scene. We went to pick the patients up and take them to the hospital. Of note, we took 3 in the ambulance. Back in the day, because at that time there were still only 3 ambulance companies in all of Howard County: Ellicott City, Clarksville, and Savage. Those are the only 3 ambulance companies. Elk Ridge, West Friendship, and Lisbon did not have an ambulance at that moment and relied on mutual aid from either in Howard County ambulances or out of Howard County ambulance. So when we ran a call back in the day, we would just pile people into the ambulance until we couldn't fit any more in. And on this particular day, ended up taking 3 people to the hospital for gunshot wounds, and they were not, fortunately, life-threatening. Another interesting thing, and the majority of the people listening to this are probably not aware of it. In fact, I wasn't aware of it until a couple of years ago when I was talking with Chief Eddie Massey, who had been with the Elk City Fire Department since the mid-50s or whatever. He said until the mid-60s, and even a little bit beyond the mid-60s, when you picked up an African-American individual, and Fells Lane at that time, Lower Fells Lane, was an African-American black community. When you pick up somebody, you would not take them to St. Agnes because St. Agnes would not accept them. We had to take the patients to Lutheran Hospital further down Edmondson Avenue in Baltimore City. But yeah, that St. Agnes Hospital until the mid to late 60s really did not want to take any black patients, and we had to take them to Lutheran Hospital. I just found that astonishing, and I made the run to Lutheran Hospital a few times back in the late 60s. Just a little bit of history there. In September of 68, September 10th, a young lad had been kidnapped, brought towards Howard County, was assaulted. I ended up taking him to the hospital. Just remember that. September 10th, 1968. In 1968, a monumental event occurred in that the first African-American volunteer, I believe in the county, definitely at Ellicott City, became a volunteer at the Ellicott City Volunteer Fire Department. I've written a couple articles about that in the past, but he was my hero in that, able to walk down from his abode up Main Street and walk into the fire station one day and as an African American ask for an application. You need to understand, back in the day, Howard County, especially Ellicott City, was really not a liberal thinking organization. There was not diversity and a whole bunch of other things. And for Mansfield to walk into the station and request a application, I mean, it took guts. He and I went to fire training together. We went down to College Park, to the fire academy there to take training, etc. And he was a hard worker, would do anything, right alongside the other firefighters. I admired him deeply for that. In the late 70s, we both went our separate ways. I was transferred to Savage, and he and I sort of lost contact. I ended up a couple years ago doing an article just about him and expressing my admiration for him as a true hero, true brave firefighter in Howard County. And I might post that again at some time. Mansfield Fuller. This incident was in the summer of 1972. Motor vehicle accident around 2 o'clock in the morning. Woody Collette and I responded to this incident. It was on Route 40 at Ridge Road and Route 29, and a car, Sebring Plus, had sideswiped a light pole and ejected the driver, who was killed instantly, and also there was a traumatic amputation of his left arm during this incident. When he and I pulled up to the scene, the patient was laying in the street, left arm had been amputated. He was killed instantly because there was essentially no blood coming from his arm, so his heart had stopped immediately. But this is what the car looked like, and I had a car almost exactly like it, red, but almost exactly like that. And again, you can see the damage to the vehicle, etc. This is the pole he hit, and on that particular day, I learned another life lesson, at least in emergency services life lesson, that almost all of us in emergency services, fire, police, EMS, learn through our experiences and our responses, that in many situations, inches make a difference and seconds make a difference. Meaning, in this situation, when the driver hit this pole, the front of his car missed the pole. The front fender and bumper missed the pole, but the back end of his car was about 6 inches to the left, and therefore struck the pole and opened it up. He was thrown out and was killed, for 6 inches. Had the rear tires followed exactly the front tires, he would have missed the pole, still probably been in an accident, but definitely would not have probably lost his life. But there are so many times that we in emergency services see where just inches and or seconds make the difference between life and death. This is one such incident. That's the car, what's left of it. I had a call years ago on College Avenue. A Mustang, souped up Mustang, was involved in an accident, hit a tree or whatever, split the car in half. And split the car in half right behind the front seat passenger and driver's seat. Split the car. This is one of the few times that I had responded where the driver was not wearing a seatbelt, because had he been wearing a seatbelt, he could have been killed. And the reason I say that, the seatbelt that he would have been wearing was just a lap seatbelt, and the connections are bolted to the floor to the rear of the driver's seat, but bolted to the section of the car that split and went a different direction. So had he been wearing the seatbelt when the car was in the accident, and that half of the car went one way and the half that he was in went another way, and had he been wearing a seatbelt, it would not have been a good day for him. So anyway, this is back in the summer of 72, I believe it is. This is interesting. On a given date, June 26, 1972, prior to that, about a year before that, Jimmy Jett and I had responded to the Schaefer Convalescent Home. We were the only two on the engine when we responded, and we arrived on location. Schaefer's Convalescent Nursing Home had been turned into apartments. And as we pulled up, light smoke was coming out of every window, every crevice, whatever. Not heavy smoke, but light smoke. So that was significant. Anyway, the bottom line is, on that particular day, the fire went to a 2-alarm fire. We were there for hours because the building was like 100 years old, and it was made of a balloon type construction, which meant the interior framing didn't have any fire stop. And so once the fire got behind the wall, the fire was able to go vertically up from the basement all the way up into the attic, and there are no fire stops to sort of contain it. And so we were there all day chopping holes in walls, etc., to find out where the fire was to extinguish it. We used that building after the fire for training, etc., and then it was decided on a given day, which just happened to be I believe June 26, 1972, that we're going to go up and we're going to burn it down, just light it off and just let it burn to get rid of it, etc. And that's where the Longgate Shopping Center is nowadays. So we went up and spent the better part of the day there burning it down. It was a great day to go up there because they were predicting torrential rains to be occurring, so that would be good to burn it down. You didn't have to worry about embers and sparks flying and going elsewhere to start on your fires. Double check the date, because you'll see that particular evening, it not only did it rain and rain and rain and rain the day that Hurricane Agnes came through. So at the beginning of the storm, we were there burning this building down, and then that particular evening, days afterwards, the remnants of Hurricane Agnes that came through Howard County and Ellicott City. Unfortunately, going back to one of the previous events, August 26 of 68, just the dude that had the shotgun ended up shooting several people on Fells Lane, and just showing the legal results of that. April 20th of 1969, late in the evening, ran a call on Route 108, actually responded on the rescue squad, Station 2's rescue squad, Rescue 29, for a head-on accident on Route 108 right near the 108 bar. It's now a wine tasting place. But anyway, by the time he got there, the patient had been extricated, had been placed in Ambulance 55's unit. She was in terrible shape, and when I got out, Chief Joe Spangler, the volunteer chief of Clarksville, was asking, was there anybody that could get in Ambulance 55 and help Joe Shaw, who was the first aider at that time, to treat the patient. And so I said, yeah, and got in the back of the Cadillac ambulance, and off to Montgomery General Hospital we went. She was in serious shape. She may have already been deceased, but we were doing the best we could to treat her, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember that, being in the back of the ambulance. It was a smooth ride. We were going fast. The patient expired. Also, the highlight of that evening when we got back to the Clarksville station, Chief Spangler, he was an administrator, executive at WBAL TV. Son, come on, I'm going to take you back to Ellicott City. So he hopped in his chief's car, and now I'm being chauffeured by a fire chief back to Station 2. That was a highlight of my early career back in April 20th, 1968. Just looking at an update on the boy that had been hit by lightning. Newspapers are saying that he's improving, and as I said before, he was eventually discharged from the hospital and with no ill effects. Although I always wondered if you could hold a light bulb and would it come on, but nah, never mind. This is a program, November 16th, 1968, banquet program at the Ellicott City Volunteer Fire Department of the first year that I was there. And if you look down on the lower right-hand corner, probationary members, you'll see my name there, Donald R. Howe, as a probationary member of Ellicott City. And I had joined Ellicott City on March 1st of 1968. This was a sad day. June 26, 1969. I responded down to the station for a burn subject. I think that's how the call came in. I was asleep, as a matter of fact, and got up and drove down quickly to the station, hopped in the ambulance, and up we went to the scene, which is near the VFW Hall on Columbia Pike, where a subject had been burned. And we get there, and sure enough, tragically, a young lady had been horribly, horribly burned. And sort of the brief scenario was that she was suffering from some mental health issues, had gone to the gas station, gotten a can of gasoline, came back, walked deep into the woods, poured the gasoline over, and lit herself off. And this is back in the days of Vietnam. Those of you that were back in those days, the Buddhist monks in Vietnam, to protest the war, would set themselves on fire. And this young lady did the same thing, set herself on fire. About 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, I don't know, the fire's out and she's still alive. So she gets up and she walks to the closest house in the development, and that's where we found the young lady. At first, when we arrived on the scene, I could not comprehend what I was looking at. She was, we'll just say she was burned horribly. Come to find out, well, after the fact, I had gone to high school with her, and I didn't know it that day. Beside the burns that she had that day, and she could speak, not well because of the burns, but she was very articulate. She is very, very aware of her surroundings, and that's, talked to her, and she was able to communicate with me. Off to the St. Agnes Hospital we went. To this day, I haven't the slightest idea what I talked to her about. And the reason I struggle with that, and I'm sure I struggled that particular day, is what do you say to a person that is horribly burned from head to toe, 4th degree burns, 3rd degree burns, 4th degree burns. I'm looking, as I'm looking at her, I'm looking at a dead person, and there's no way she's going to be able to survive this. But onto the hospital we went. I know I'm talking to her, but what do you talk about? I mean, what do you talk about? I mean, I can't ask her, what does she want for Christmas? Is she going on vacation this summer? I don't know. I didn't ask those things, but what do you say to somebody that you know is just not going to survive? So we got to St. Agnes Hospital, and I transitioned at the hospital to the nurse that was going to take care of her, and we ultimately left. A very interesting side note is the nurse that I handed the patient off to, this young lady off to, 5 years later became my wife. That was Ann Shoeker back then, but yeah, that's the first first patient that I handled that she also remembers handling, and it was obviously a rather significant and very sad situation. This is a copy of the news article, applications invited for firefighters for Elk City Volunteer Fire Department, because initially, prior to 1972, all the firefighters, career firefighters in the county, were employees of the local volunteer fire department. Elk City is no different, and this is just the advertisement for Elk City wanting to hire firefighters. As you can see, you can see the starting salary back then in 1969, 1970. The starting salary was $6,750. Not a month, not a week, but a year. And I was hired off of that particular list. Jimmy Jett was the first one to be hired off of that list in early January of 70. And then Marty Lepore and I were hired off that list, started in April 20th of 1970. And actually, Mike Dorsey was brought on in mid-July. And the reason he brought on in mid-July is he had a National Guard commitment prior to that. But the four of us were hired off of this advertisement for the grand total of $6,750. And I thought I was in tall cotton, getting paid for what I enjoyed to do, etc. Never regretted it, never regretted that decision. This one on July 21st of 1969, which, if you look at the date, it's significant, and I'll tell you why that date is significant in a couple moments. But around midnight or so of July 21st, 1969, responded from the station to a fender bender on Frederick Road, right at Toll House Road, right adjacent to Route 29. We arrived on the scene. What it was is that several hombres were being chased by a Maryland State Police officer, Pete Edge, as a matter of fact, who was a piece of work, a positive piece of work himself, was being chased by Pete Edge down Toll House Road. Those who are familiar with Toll House Road, it's a long, steep hill going down. Apparently, Pete had read the memo about the steep hill of Toll House Road going down, coming to a T intersection, and on the other side of that intersection was almost a vertical dirt wall. So in other words, it didn't go anywhere. So either he read the memo, and I'm making the assumption he did. The bad guys apparently either didn't get the memo, didn't read it, or forgot about the memo. And when they went down Toll House Road, got to the end, doing 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, whatever they're doing, they didn't stop. The dirt embankment stopped them, but they didn't. I remember responding, got there. There were several people in the vehicle. I quickly assessed and triaged. The driver was the most significantly critical injured. That was the patient that I chose that particular evening because of the way he was positioned, the status of the vehicle, etc. I remember reaching down into the vehicle and trying to extricate him, and just got myself in a really bad position where I wrenched or strained my back. It was an attention getter. We finally got the patient out and onto the stretcher, into the ambulance. In fact, personnel had to help me into the ambulance. My back was hurting me so bad. Again, off to the hospital we went, got to St. Agnes Hospital, and as we were wheeling the patient into the emergency department and transferring him over, that's when he expired. They tried to resuscitate him, and he didn't. I mentioned before the date that occurred. If you look it up in Howard County history, the day before, it was a hot summer day. There were going to be thunderstorms coming through, so I went down to the firehouse, and it wasn't long before that I was at the firehouse we could hear that the thunderstorm was coming through western Howard County. They're getting multiple fire calls. They got a barn fire that they were being dispatched to. We shortly thereafter got dispatched for a house fire on either Boone's Lane or Pine Orchard Lane. I was on the second engine out, and up the road we went. I can remember being on the back step and just listening to chatter, radio chatter that was coming out of the cab of the engine. There's something about a bad accident. They needed multiple ambulances to respond. And I was thinking at that time, again, there were only 3 ambulance companies in all of Howard County, Ellicott City, Clarksville, and Savage. And I was thinking that if they requested enough ambulances, they may request the ambulance out of Ellicott City. I'm sure that what they would have done, they would have sent the ambulance up to the fire scene where I was, picked me up, and headed west. The bottom line is that they were able to get enough ambulances out of county to assist with that incident. The house fire that we went on, we were able to keep burning for hours. For whatever reason, we didn't want to put it out. It was an occupied house, but we didn't want to put it out. And it burned for hours. We were chasing the fire through the house, etc. When the fire was over with, finally went back to the station late in the evening. We're cleaning up, washing hose, repacking hose. It was then that we found out that what had happened in western Howard County was a fire, a barn fire, and the Lisbon engine was responding, and they hit a muddy patch, spun out and rammed an embankment backwards and killed 2 of the firefighters outright just then. Another firefighter was seriously injured and died from complications a year or 2 later. But that was the same day, a tragic situation. They were the 3rd, 4th, and 5th firefighters killed. Ellicott City had the first 2 firefighters killed back on Christmas Day of 1952, I believe it was. So then after we got things cleaned up, we all crammed into the TV room. If you look at that date, that was the day that the moon men were landing. Neil Armstrong was going to walk on the moon, so we all crowded in the TV room to watch that. And that's when we got the motor vehicle accident at Toll House Road. That date, that 24 hours, that 12 hours, was significant to me, in that severe thunderstorms came through the county, responded to a working house fire. At the same time, the Lisbon Volunteer Fire Department had their horrific accident that occurred, and then later on that evening, we were going to be watching the Moon Men land, Neil Armstrong do his thing, and then we didn't get to watch it because of that accident at Toll House Road. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. This is another fender bender, College Avenue. It may have been one of the first fender benders I responded to in College Avenue, which was known, I believe, in the region, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, Howard County, around as the 7 Hills. That College Avenue was an old country road that just went up and down, up and down, up and down hills. And basically, the teenagers would like to go there and get a full head of steam and to crest the hill and actually become airborne, and then slam down on the other side and onto the next hill and do the same thing over and over again. Actually, a good friend of mine, his son tried that one time. I think it was with his father's car, and got a really good head of steam, jumped the hill, slammed down, came down so hard that it broke the shock absorber mounts on the rear, and the shock absorbers came up and through the trunk. So that was a little bit of trivia. Anyway, on this particular one, car lost control and rolled and ran into a tree and then spun out. That's me on the right-hand side, waiting for personnel to extricate the individual. I think there are 3 individuals in the vehicle. I had already assessed all 3. Last patient, the one that they're trying to extricate, was the front seat passenger. He was partially trapped underneath the roof of that particular vehicle. Actually, when we pulled up on the scene, the engine was on fire, and I got out with the fire extinguisher and put the fire out on the engine, assessed the patients, and right now I'm waiting for me to have access to the vehicle. And this young lad, the front right seat passenger, eventually passed away. This was the interior of the vehicle. The young lad was the passenger sitting on the other side, and it had been partially ejected when it crashed and rolled over. Again, this is the vehicle itself, and the front seat passenger was the one that expired, and there are at least 2 other people in the vehicle. Could have been 3 others, but 2 other people. And again, the vehicle just from a different angle. The young lad that died was the front seat passenger when the vehicle rolled over and partially ejected him underneath the vehicle. This was interesting. Back in the fall of 1975, I believe, there was a fire called chimney fire on Melba Avenue, actually the same place where the same general location where the child was struck by lightning. But there's a chimney fire, and units arrived on the scene. There's a standard chimney fire. Units got there, and they had thrown a ladder to the peak of the roof. I marked it off, checked the peak of the roof was where the arrow is pointing. And it's a 35-foot extension ladder, and the ladder essentially reached the peak of the roof. Jimmy Jett was assigned to take a roof ladder up and then get onto the roof and do his thing with the chimney. Well, the bottom line is as he climbed the ladder, and just before he got off the ladder, the top section of the ladder suddenly retracted, dropped down about 10 feet or so, and what you see here is Jimmy Jett midair. I took this picture, still holding on to the roof ladder, and all those white dots are the reflected tape on his turnout coat. But right now he's in midair, coming down 3 stories to the ground below. He went from the peak of the roof down past the 2nd floor and then down past the 1st floor to the ground below. I actually, just by reflex, I was able to snap off 3 quick pictures from my little Instamatic Cube camera. This is the first one I took, and as I'm running up, I took 2 more. The other 2 pictures that I can't find, one caught him hitting the ground initially, and the second picture, he's off the ground about 4 inches because he's bouncing back up. Anyway, I ended up hopping on an ambulance and took Jimmy to St. Agnes Hospital. Miraculously, his only real injury was a fractured sternum, which is bad enough, but a fractured sternum, so he survived. And again, this is just another picture. You can see where the peak of the roof is. You can see that the ladder has now retracted, and the reason it retracted is because what they call the dogs had not been secured or locked, and when he got up to the top, ladder retracted. But that's Jimmy in midair, still holding onto the roof ladder as he's going past the roof, past the 2nd floor, and past the 1st floor. In the 70s, we were fortunate to be able to get a Dalmatian dog that rode with us, Yogi. The community loved him, the kids loved him, and we had him, I think, 5 years, 6 years, or whatever. That sucker, anytime a fire call would come in, he was the first one down the steps, out into the engine bay, and would hop on either the engine that was going out first, or he'd hop on the hook and ladder truck that was going out. And so, for 5 years or whatever, 6 years, he never missed a call. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But he would be on that call, on the engine, off he'd go. He was loved by almost everybody, not 100%, but was quite the figure to be seen around the firehouse and on apparatus. This is just back in the early 70s, there had been a whole rash of drug overdoses. And this is the only reason I'm showing you this is that this is a newspaper article. Journalism back in the day was totally different than it is today, but this was a newspaper article that was posted. Tommy Watkins and I responded to this call, and we ended up taking him out of the house and then ultimately to St. Agnes Hospital for treatment, and tragically he expired. But there had been a whole rash of these drug overdoses in the county, in the Elk City area in the 70s, and that was just one that we responded to. Jimmy Jett and I responded to this one night. The Venus Garden apartments were on fire. They were under construction and had started, I think it was a salamander, just a heating unit, I believe that had caused the fire, but we responded that evening. I was the officer on the engine. It had been raining like a summer gun. It was muddy. We drove up an access road to get to the apartment complex, and we drove up as far as we could until we sunk in the mud up to the frame. We did our firefighting from that point on. But yeah, that was an interesting evening. Two items on this. One is the top article, a barn fire on Old Frederick Road near Daniels. Keyvolver's boarding home for children. Barn burnt, tragically killed several sheep in the fire. The article below is a tragic accident that killed, I believe, E.T. Clark of Clark Hardware. He and his wife were killed in a tragic accident. They were driving down south, towing a trailer, mobile home. I believe wind caught it and took them over the bridge and into the lake, and they were killed. A tragic loss to the organization. April 20th of 72, it looks like yet another fire along the Patapsco River Valley. A good time was had by all that particular day. Phil Gershon and I, we walked from Ilchester all the way back to the firehouse, putting out spot fires all along the tracks because they couldn't get fire apparatus along the tracks. Most of the fire apparatus was up on the hill, up on the mountain, putting the fire out. But he and I walked all the way from Ilchester all the way back to Ellicott City. These are, again, not chronological, but this is just an article about the country store fire, the first time I ever drove a fire truck. And then the top portion of this article is just talking about Yogi, YT Bear, as we used to call him. We used to have to fill out a fire report, and back in the day, when you filled out a fire report, you put the individual's first two initials and then the person's last name. So Yogi, we refer to him as YT Bear. That's how he put his name on the fire report. YT referred to Yogi the Bear. So anytime that he ran a call, we put him on the report as YT Bear. Just looking at the newspaper article that's discussing the fire on Main Street at Columbia Pike in the country store. Just giving a newspaper accounting. Apparently, Dave Tumlin received some sort of minor injury and was taken to the hospital. This is just a picture of me as the fire progressed that particular day. Hank Long came down, mercifully took over the pumping operations from me so I could go play fireman and do some firefighting that particular day. This was an accident that occurred on October 1st, 1973. Four gentlemen were coming home after having attended a Baltimore Oriole baseball game. They were coming north on Route 29, approaching Route 40, when at a high rate of speed, they left the road, went off the right-hand side of the road and down an embankment and did a nosedive into the ditch right adjacent to another section of road below. When they did that nosedive, the vehicle itself stopped, but the engine block didn't stop. It was torn from the vehicle, shot across 3 lanes of highway, hit a guardrail on the other side, and then came back halfway back. Not only was the engine block thrown out from the vehicle, but all 4 occupants somehow or other were thrown from the vehicle and onto the road. That particular night, when the call came in, I was a station officer. Ed Rabine was the dispatcher, and he had inadvertently keyed the mic as he was taking the 911 call for this, and you could just hear him saying, "What is it? Where? How many people are laying on the road?" And so I got up and I was going to call him to tell him, you got the mic open. And when I did, he said, "Yeah, we got a bad accident. Motor vehicle. You got at least 4 people laying in the road." So this was just weeks or so before we were getting ready to open up Fire Station 8, the Bethany Fire Station. So we had essentially all air equipment, and we had at least an engine and an ambulance that was going to be assigned to the Bethany station. When the call came in like that there were 4 people laying in the road, I made the command decision and there were 4 of us working, and I cannot remember who the 4 of us were, but I told her we're going to take both ambulances right off the bat, and the volunteers, when they come in, they'll be able to take out the squad of the engine company. So I made the unusual move of taking both ambulances out initially within 1 minute of each other to the scene. When we pulled up to the scene, indeed there were 4 people laying in the street. I quickly assessed the 4 and determined that one was viable, and that's the patient that myself, and I think it's Woody Collette was with me, and that's the patient we ended up taking to the hospital, and that's the only patient that survived. This ended up being the worst accident as far as number of fatalities that I ever ran in my career. I had other accidents where there are many, many more people injured, dozen and a half, 2 dozen, but in one incident. But this was the worst as far as fatalities. This is looking at the vehicle that left the side of the road, came down the embankment, hit the ditch, The vehicle itself stopped, but it tore out the engine block that went across the highway. And the four people, I really don't understand how the four people in that vehicle were all ejected from the vehicle, and they were laying in the street by the time we got there. This is to the rear of the vehicle will be Golden Triangle ramp looking underneath at Route 29 where this particular section merged. And on the left-hand side, that's where the vehicle shot down the embankment, hit into the culvert or the ditch there, and the engine block shot across the highway and back, and the four occupants were laying in the road when we got there. And again, that's the vehicle. And how the heck those four were ejected from that vehicle. There was no extrication required. They were all gone from the vehicle. Out of order, but this is the country store fire picture taken well afterwards. And this is the fire responded to my very first call as a driver, and we got there and the roof and the third floor were on fire. For me, that was a day to remember. This is September of 1973. The very first EMT class to be taught in Howard County was going to be taught at the Howard Community College, and I was going to be one of the two instructors. My mentor, because I had been blessed as an EMT instructor, not because I knew anything, but I was the highest trained individual in Howard County, that I'm going to be blessed to be an EMT instructor. I didn't know what an EMT instructor was, and half the skills, I didn't know what they were. But I was now going to be teaching one or two classes that were being taught in tandem. One class was going to be taught on Mondays and Wednesdays by another instructor, and I was going to teach the other class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And as I said, a lot of the skills that were going to be taught, I had no clue. Blood pressures, airways, I had no idea how to do those things. So I was going to have a mentor teach Mondays and Wednesdays. And on a given day prior to the start, several weeks before class, I was going to meet the instructor who was going to be teaching on Mondays and Wednesdays. I remember him coming up to a tall gentleman, came up to the fire station where I was working that particular day, got there, and I want to know, is this the Elk City station? Yeah. And I said, yeah, I'm Don Howe. And he said, yeah, my name is Jeff Mitchell. Holy mackerel. Yep, that was the first time I met Jeff. And he and I, we struck out a personal and professional friendship that went on for years and years and years. At that time, he was a respiratory therapist at St. Agnes Hospital and also taught, I believe, elementary school, was a teacher at elementary school in Arbutus. But he was going to be teaching Mondays and Wednesdays. The humorous thing is that I would attend his class, taking copious amounts of notes, everything he's saying and what have you, paying close attention to every skill that he's teaching. The complicated taking blood pressures and complicated inserting airways. I'm taking copious amounts of notes during the evening. I'd get home and I'd be up half the night rewriting the notes, etc. Because the next day, that Tuesday, I'm teaching the class that I just learned about and saw for the first time the day before. And that's how it went through the entire schedule. If the truth be known, and I'm just sharing that now with you since you are all my friends, that's the only class, that's the only EMT class that I ever taught from beginning to end. It's the only complete class that I've ever taught. Now, I've taught many other classes. It did segments, guest lectures, and full segments, but that's the only class that I ever taught in total. Now, the class started in the fall. In the spring, the class is still going on, but I was then assigned to Sinai Hospital to take the CRT program, Intermediate Advanced Life Support Program. So now, not only am I working full-time, I'm taking the EMT class, I'm teaching the EMT class, and I am taking the intermediate CRT class all at the same time. And as it actually turned out, I took the class that spring, and then it was requested I come back early summer to become a CRT instructor. So I sat through another CRT class to watch and learn, and take notes, and then I had to teach another class where I was the primary instructor. So I was at Sinai Hospital for 4 or 5 months, 6 months, something like that. So that's how part of my early EMS career began. Again, May 9th, 1974 is just articles just touting the EMT class where we had a total of 41 students graduate and become the first EMTs in the county. Back on April 19th, 1976, yet another brush fire along the tracks, Tapsco Valley. Mark Richardson and I, we were on the engine brush unit, was the first out. The engine was the second piece out. We were there all day running up and down Route 40 along the tracks, Daniels. It was an interesting day. It was a fun day, but it was an interesting day. So we were essentially the first unit out. We stayed out for about 6 hours, and then finally, toward the evening, we finally came back to the station as the very last unit to clear the scene. So again, another one of those fires along the Patapsco Valley, started by the train and for quite a distance. Deviating just a tad bit, not on this call, but another call that we had a brush fire up in Daniels, up along the river, and on that particular day, whenever that was, we responded, and sure enough, the fire had started at the bottom of the hill and had already spread up to, and it was going past the summit of the hill, or the summit of the valley, the summit of the mountain. And I was assigned to take an Indian tank, which is basically a 5-gallon tank of water with the combined weight of the tank and the water weighed about 50 pounds, to walk up this steep hill to put out fire that had gone over the hill. So I'm climbing up this steep hill, and I'm climbing from sapling to tree. It was a struggle because it was a steep hill. I remember getting to the very top of it finally, and I was winded, and I said, to heck with this. The fire had already gone past the top of the hill. It was burning, and I figured, I was there by myself at that time, and to heck with it. It can burn. I'll catch up to it later. I decided I'm going to sit down, lay down, and take a rest. I take off the Indian tank and put it down to my right. I lay down in the ashes right next to it. And after about 30 seconds or so, I took a look at the Indian tank to my right. Then I looked up in the sky, and then I looked to my left. And within 18 inches, no more than 24 inches, is a copperhead. A real copper. I know my snakes. It was a copperhead. I was not aware that I could jump from a laying position 15 feet over the Indian tank to a place of safety. It was a scare. When I finally got my nerve up, I came walking back, and what had happened was that the fire had come up, had burnt over the snake, didn't discolor it whatsoever, but killed it. It was dead, but it was laying right there. I laid, and when I came back and was able to look at the snake or whatever, it was right there. And I laid right down next to it. Had that sucker been alive, I probably had a little tooth marks in my arm or something. But yeah, that was a shocker. I was going to take it down with me to mess with whoever the pump operator was, but I decided against that. This is me as the operator of Truck 2. I was not only the operator of Truck 2, I was the officer of Truck 2, and I was the entire crew of Truck 2 at the Norney Bowling Alley, where we had there's a small equipment shed to the rear that had caught on fire, was essentially, was extinguished. But I had driven the truck up there by myself, and I was the crew, laddered the building, took up fans, etc. But yeah, that was back in the day when it was not unusual, unfortunately because of staffing or lack thereof, that we would take apparatus out by ourselves. And on that particular day, I took the ladder truck up to the scene by myself. This looks like around April 20th of 1976, a real tragic situation. A young man was in the garage, apparently filling a lawnmower with a gasoline, and apparently he was smoking. And smoking and pouring gasoline doesn't mix, and caught on fire, and there's a big flashover within the garage itself. The young man was burned. He ran to the interior garage door, ran into the house, and then there was a person working in the basement, and he ran down the basement. That's who called the fire department for us to respond. I was on the call. I think I'm the person at the very front of that stretcher, that we're carrying the stretcher. But I can clearly remember, and it was disputed, not by the fire service, but by others. But I can clearly remember we were in the basement. We had put the patient on the air stretcher. We're getting ready to carry him through the basement and up the steps. And as we're doing that, clearly he was lucid, conscious, and he's even telling us while he's laying on this stretcher, watch out, my drum's over here, look over to your left. So he knew, he was alert and oriented in my mind. I have no doubt about that. We ended up taking him, upstairs, and then we landed a helicopter right in front of his house, off to the burn unit. The family, as I remember, they disputed it because my son never smoked, was a statement. And yet State Fire Marshal found evidence of a cigarette And I believe that he even said that he was smoking. So there was the official report that came out, and then there was the expectation that the family had that had been some other source. Either way, it was tragic. We were loading to the burn unit, and off he went, and did not survive. Yogi, one day that there was a fire call, and actually the piece of apparatus that they're going to take was a brush unit that was across the street in the annex. And as the call came in and personnel were running to get apparatus, Yogi followed one firefighter who was now running across the street to get the brush unit out. And when he did, ran across the street and was struck by a car. Chief Shipley, Harrison Shipley, apparently witnessed it, and God bless him, stopped, carefully picked him up, put him in the chief's car, and raced him off to one of the vets in the area, where he was treated for a fractured leg. He eventually recovered very well, but he was treated like a king for just 3 or 4 weeks of recovery. He got whatever food he wanted. We would carry him up the steps to his bunk or whatever. And as you can see, the bulletin board there, him being struck by a car was newsworthy. There's some headlines, YT Bear struck by a car. School children started sending, get well cards, etc., dog biscuits for YT Bear to receive. And he relished that particular activity. Daniels Mill was another major incident that occurred in September of 1977. Until 1972, it had been an active mill and an active community, as a matter of fact. Multiple mill houses, and had a grocery store, church, post office. It was a viable mill town. Yet when Hurricane Agnes came through, it destroyed the facility, 100% destroyed it. It was abandoned, never to be occupied again. And then in September of 1977, fire started in the building, burnt every building that was there. Richard Freeze, leaving the Bethany fire station, when he pulled out, he could see the huge glow in the sky. So he knew we had a working fire. I was on the engine coming out of Ellicott City. John Klein was driving. And I still remember coming down Daniels Road, and as we made the last turn to where the dam was and you could see the mill, you could have played baseball, you could have played cards, you could have done anything, because that whole valley right there was just lit up as bright as the middle of the day. And so we spent the rest of the night there and part of the next day there working on the fire. The bottom line is a total loss. You really couldn't gain access to it. We just basically let it burn. We threw some water on it, but between the railroad tracks being there, no real 360-degree access, and we knew the building had been long abandoned. It was a total loss. Just another article about the Daniels Mill. Daniels Flames did what the tide, meaning the Hurricane Agnes, couldn't do. This was in October of 77, October 9th, 77. Call came in on Lower Main Street as a building fire with people trapped. Dave Daugherty was the driver, I was the officer, and down the street we went. By the time we got there, got right on location, the occupants had already left the building. There was a child that had been dropped from the one window that you see to civilians below, and the other two occupants were able to get out of the building. This was the only fire that I ever actually was injured and had to go to the hospital to be treated for a puncture wound, glass, metal, or nail or something stuck me in the leg, and I had to get several stitches. The only other 2 times that I had an injury or a medical emergency, twice, didn't have to go to the hospital. I probably should have, but I suffered from heat exhaustion. One was on a brush fire along the Patapsco River, where I was going to pass out from heat exhaustion. Had to lay down until it passed. The second time was a fire down in Elkridge at a historic mansion down there. And I was on the truck, went down, and it had been a really working fire in one of the rooms, really working fire. And the building was constructed of granite or limestone blocks. And the only reason I'm saying that is an intense fire, but the boys from Elkridge put it out. But the heat was still there. The heat was not going to dissipate. Part of my assignment was to go in and do overhaul and open up the windows, whatever. My body just did not tolerate heat. I remember staggering out to the building and down the front steps and laying down, and took my breathing apparatus off and laid down. None of the other firefighters, they're stepping over me, going about their business. Here I am laying down on the ground, wiped out from heat exhaustion. So much for friends. This was an interesting call. November of 77. Call for a person who had jumped off the Route 40 Patapsco River Bridge. We responded, arrived on the scene, and what it was is a lady had been coming down Route 40 heading to Baltimore County. She was bent on doing herself harm. She tried to drive through the retaining wall of the bridge. When she did that, she didn't go through the wall. She stopped. She gets up on the hood of the car and jumps. I mean, she didn't look. She just got on the hood of the car and jumped. And apparently, 80, 100 feet down she went. We pulled up. I walked over, and people saying she's down there. And I remember walking over and looking, and she's down there. And I'm thinking, holy mackerel, she's going to be only about 2 feet tall or something. I took some equipment with me. I slid down the hill, all the way down to the bottom of the hill. Eventually walked over to her. Now, this is after Hurricanes Agnes and Eloise. So the Patapsco River bed or river at that time had nothing but huge trees that had been dislodged and were all over the place. Huge rocks that had been reassembled, whatever. It was just a field of that. And when I finally was able to locate her and get to her, where she landed was the only spot that had a big sand dune amidst these rocks and trees, and she hit right in the center of that. It broke her fall. I mean, she was still injured, but the only place that she could have landed was right there. The other interesting thing about this call, as we're working on her to get her stabilized, I had requested a brush unit to come up, four-wheel drive unit to come up from Hollifield, and we're going to take her out and up to a landing site. And as we're doing that, the next thing I hear is a noise, a bunch of whirling noise, and look over about 100 feet to my right, and here's the MSP Bell Ranger helicopter landing about 100 feet away. And this sucker had come way down below the bridge and had landed, and that made our job a whole lot easier. It turned out that the helicopter pilot on that call was Edwin Hanna, childhood friend I had known in earlier days, and he had gone on to be a Howard County CSO, but then went on to Maryland State Police and was one of their helicopter pilots. Tragically, his older brother, Gary Hanna, had lost his life in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot when he was shot down. A bit of trivia also. Back in 78, there was disparity within the department, disparity within the administration about the importance of EMS. EMS was looked upon as, maybe it still is, but as a necessary evil to be with the fire service. The administration was really not EMS oriented, and this is just one example of the differences of opinion, etc., that were going on. In my career within the fire service, I was always sort of at odds with the administration. My vision of where EMS should go didn't exactly match where the current administrations and multiple administrations felt it should go, and its importance. And that's sort of was just the history of EMS, I guess, in the county. Ironically, Paul Lepore, in this article, he was the fire administrator at that time, and again, was not a strong advocate for EMS. It's there, but firefighting is much more important, etc. And it wasn't until one day that I got a call from Ellicott City to respond to the Weir building up Court Avenue, and sure enough, it was the fire administrator's office, and Paul was having a heart attack. And in I walk, and I did a great job. I were able to get him out of the building, gave him first-class treatment, etc. And he did express he was eternally grateful for the care that I gave him. Spoke highly of my treatment, etc. Giving him oxygen, taking his blood pressure, talking to him, tried to alleviate any concerns he may have had at that time, and went to St. Agnes Hospital. So at one point, he was the recipient of my care on that particular day and time. This is just a continuation of the article about EMS, cardiac rescue technicians, etc. As I said, there are different opinions as to the importance and the priority of EMS versus the vision of the administration back in those days. Through my entire career, that sort of persisted. This is an incident, November 30th of 79, on North St. John's Lane. A church was being constructed, rafters were being set, and a strong windstorm came through and boom, like dominoes, knocked down the rafters, and it injured 4 or 5 people, as I remember correctly. We ended up taking them all to various hospitals. That's Chief Shaw on the left, far left. I'm standing next to him. Tony Grable, Vince Glorioso, John Fisher, Richard Fries, Dennis Beard, Ronnie Huffman, are just some of the folks that are in this particular picture. Please use your remaining heartbeats wisely, and not waste a single precious one.